A physically exhausted, severely deteriorating man trembles in the isolation of his private quarters, his daily functioning entirely dependent on a staggering lethal volume of prescribed pharmaceutical chemicals. Yet, on the silver screen, this same man is worshipped as an invincible god. To his devoted fans, he is a rugged, sun-drenched idol, commanding the adoration of hundreds of millions. But to his harshest critics, he is nothing more than a fake cowboy, carefully manufactured for mass consumption. These jarring opposites belong to one man, Elvis Aaron Presley. Was he truly a sovereign king, or merely the most fiercely exploited gear in the ruthless machinery of Hollywood? The genesis of this tragedy stems directly from the brutal, profit-driven mechanics of the late 1950s Hollywood studio system. During this transitional era, the studio system operated as a ruthless, highly efficient printing press, and the Western genre was its most reliable engine of wealth. While audiences sat in crowded drive-in theaters and later in their living rooms mesmerized by staticky VHS tapes, cheering for rugged, invincible frontiersmen, the reality behind the camera was bleak and entirely devoid of romance. The industry was built on the foundation of an impenetrable archetype, the stoic men of the West, popularized by figures like John Wayne and Gary Cooper, who did not bleed, did not cry, and never fractured under the immense pressure of their environments. To the aging, profit-driven studio executives pulling the strings, actors and stuntmen were merely cogs in this vast industrial machine. They were assets to be utilized, driven into the ground, and expected to endure staggering physical and emotional demands without a single word of complaint. It was a factory of grueling schedules and unrelenting pressure, where the frontier myth was sold wholesale to an innocent public, carefully obscuring the profound human cost that was exacted behind the lens. Beneath the veneer of this cinematic machine lay the quiet, unfulfilled, and fiercely guarded ambition of a young boy from Tupelo, Mississippi. Many film historians believe that Elvis Presley never truly wanted to be confined to the role of a singing heartthrob on the silver screen. Behind closed doors, he harbored a deep, quiet reverence for the method acting movement that was sweeping through the artistic underground. He meticulously studied the brooding, vulnerable intensity of James Dean and the raw, explosive power of Marlon Brando. He desperately craved the opportunity to portray gritty, complex characters, men of substance who carried deep psychological scars, who hurt and who bled. For Elvis, the Western genre was not supposed to be a cartoonish playground. It was supposed to be a canvas where he could strip away the glamorous trappings of his musical fame and reveal the profound, unspoken traumas of the human condition. He saw the rugged landscape of dramatic cinema as his singular escape route from the restrictive, suffocating box of pop idolatry, hoping to prove to the world and to himself that he was an artist of genuine transformative depth. However, his initial foray into the unforgiving landscape of dramatic cinema quickly devolved into his first profound and humiliating betrayal. When he signed the contract for the 1956 film originally titled The Reno Brothers, which would later be rebranded as Love Me Tender, he genuinely believed he was stepping into a legitimate, serious Western picture. He threw himself into the preparation, learning his lines meticulously, eager to prove his worth alongside seasoned, dramatic actors. But the Hollywood machine, inherently cynical and relentlessly focused on the bottom line, had vastly different plans. Executives, observing his captive, hysterical audience of teenage fans, aggressively intervened in the creative process. They ruthlessly butchered the script's pacing and narrative integrity, forcing mandatory musical interludes right into the middle of tense, dramatic sequences. The ultimate crushing humiliation came when he was directed to perform a gentle ballad while tending to a horse, effectively neutering the rugged, complex outlaw he had been hired to portray. Instead of drawing a revolver in a moment of cinematic tension, he was commanded to strum a guitar, an act that felt less like acting and more like a cruel public surrender. The psychological fallout from this artistic castration was immediate and deeply damaging. It was the shattering of his creative innocence, the agonizing realization that in the eyes of the studio heads, he was not an actor capable of delivering profound emotional truths, but merely a singing prop in a cowboy hat. The destruction of a young artist's spirit was only the prelude to a far more visceral tragedy. The systematic, agonizing dismantling of his physical body. To fully grasp the magnitude of this physical toll, one must strip away the romanticized gloss of the Hollywood Western and examine the brutal, hazardous reality of the B-movie production sets of the late 1950s and 1960s. These locations were not glamorous playgrounds of cinematic magic. They were punishing extreme environments that pushed human endurance to the breaking point. The frontier was often simulated in the desolate, blistering expanses of the Mojave Desert or Death Valley, where the natural elements were as hostile as the studio executives orchestrating the shoots. Audiences sitting in air-conditioned theaters marveled at the effortless stoicism of the men on screen, entirely oblivious to the fact that simply surviving a single day on these sets was a feat of staggering physical endurance. Picture standing beneath a blinding, unrelenting sun, where temperatures frequently soared well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, baking the arid earth into cracked clay. Now, envision being tightly wrapped in heavy, unyielding denim, thick canvas, and suffocating leather, the mandated wardrobe for the mythical American cowboy. For 12 to 14 grueling hours each day, the actors were subjected to this stifling heat, unable to seek refuge or adequate rest. Furthermore, the air they breathed was a toxic concoction of environmental hazards. To enhance the visual grit of the frontier, industrial fans blasted actors with choking artificial dust, filling their lungs with particulate matter. This was compounded by the acrid, asphyxiating smoke of blank gunfire and the constant, overwhelming stench of animal sweat and exhaustion. Numerous biographers and set workers from that era indicate that the working conditions bordered on the inhumane, operating under a merciless schedule designed to maximize profit while minimizing production time. In this suffocating atmosphere, Elvis was expected to project an aura of vibrant, untamed masculinity, smiling through the sweat and the dirt, while his body quietly began to buckle under the strain. The environmental torment was inextricably linked to the physical demands of the action itself. The Hollywood machine of this era demanded a visceral, kinetic realism to satisfy the public's thirst for frontier justice, yet it operated without the stringent safety protocols or advanced stunt technology of modern filmmaking. Elvis, driven by a desperate need to prove his legitimacy as a rugged leading man, frequently threw himself into the physical fray. He was coerced by the sheer momentum of the production schedule into performing dangerous, punishing choreography. He engaged in brutal, bare-knuckle brawls that sent him crashing through breakaway props and hard wooden tables. He endured jarring, violent falls from horseback, his body absorbing the massive kinetic impact of the unforgiving desert floor. There was no protective padding thick enough to negate the force of these collisions, and the cameras kept rolling regardless of the bruises, the sprains, or the agonizing jolts to the skeletal system. Because the studio schedule was a relentless, grinding engine, frequently demanding that a star churn out up to 3 feature films in a single calendar year. There was absolutely no window for physical rehabilitation. Severe cumulative traumas began to aggressively compound. Microfractures, torn ligaments, and catastrophic compressions to his spine, cervical vertebrae, and lower back became the silent, agonizing reality of his daily existence. When a cowboy fell on screen, the audience cheered the spectacle. When the director yelled, "Cut," the actor was left to drag a broken, screaming body back to a makeshift dressing room. The pain was not a fleeting discomfort, it became a chronic, blinding companion. Under normal circumstances, a medical professional would mandate immediate rest, physical therapy, and a cessation of all strenuous activity to allow the battered anatomy to heal. However, in the high-stakes economy of the Hollywood studio system, halting a production for the sake of an actor's health was viewed as an unacceptable financial hemorrhage. By the dawn of the 1960s, a profound, aching desperation had taken root within the young entertainer. Returning from his highly publicized military service in West Germany, he was no longer a naive teenager easily placated by the blinding flashbulbs of sudden fame. He was a maturing man, deeply haunted by the terrifying realization that his entire cinematic career was being systematically steered into an artistic wasteland. It was during this critical juncture in the twilight of 1960 that he mounted a fierce, almost life-or-death rebellion against the suffocating grip of the Hollywood machine. The battleground for this desperate uprising was a gritty, uncompromising film titled Flaming Star. This was not another sanitized cotton candy musical featuring a pristine cowboy strumming a guitar to a captive audience of adoring extras. It was a bleak, violent, and morally ambiguous Western narrative concerning a half-Kiowa, half-white youth named Pacer Burton, who finds himself agonizingly torn apart by a brutal, blood-soaked racial conflict. A number of film historians and biographers frequently note that this profoundly complex, tormented role had originally been conceived for Marlon Brando. For Elvis, acquiring this script was akin to finding water in a barren desert. It was the ultimate golden opportunity to violently shed his pop idol caricature and resurrect his shattered dream of becoming a respected, dramatic heavyweight in American cinema. Fueled by a staggering, almost feverish level of dedication, he threw himself completely into the agonizing physical reality of the production. He was entirely determined to prove to the cynical studio executives, and more importantly to himself, that he was a legitimate actor capable of carrying a heavy, traumatic narrative. Some set observers and archival accounts suggest that his commitment bordered on self-flagellation. He vehemently refused to rely on stunt doubles for the more punishing sequences, insisting on absorbing the visceral impact of the Western landscape himself. He rode wild, uncooperative horses bareback across unforgiving, treacherous terrain, his muscles screaming under the strain. He engaged in brutal, unchoreographed hand-to-hand combat, allowing the grit, the dirt, and the artificial blood to cake into his skin. He was pushing his body to the absolute brink of its endurance, sacrificing his own physical well-being to achieve a raw, unvarnished authenticity that could never be found in a recording studio. Every bruise he sustained, every jagged scrape on his knuckles, was worn as a silent, desperate badge of honor. He believed, with an agonizingly pure naivety, that if he just bled enough on the soundstage, the Hollywood establishment would finally be forced to respect his artistic soul. However, this fiercely independent rebellion was being closely monitored by a man who viewed artistic integrity as a direct threat to his financial empire, Colonel Tom Parker. As the principal architect of the young star's career, Parker operated not as a mentor, but as a ruthless, calculating ringmaster. When Parker viewed the early dailies of Flaming Star, he was reportedly horrified, not by the violence or the tragedy of the narrative, but by the glaring absence of a lucrative soundtrack album. To Parker, a film was merely a 2-hour promotional vehicle designed exclusively to sell vinyl records to teenage girls. The sight of his prized golden goose covered in cinematic blood and delivering lines of profound despair was entirely incompatible with the lucrative manufactured image he controlled. Consequently, Parker aggressively intervened. He weaponized his immense contractual power, ruthlessly pressuring the executives at 20th Century Fox to dilute the film's harsh reality. He demanded that musical numbers be awkwardly and forcefully injected into the tense, dramatic storyline, demonstrating a chilling indifference to the narrative flow or the psychological depth of the character. This brutal, calculated interference was the ultimate proof that the manager viewed his client not as a developing human artist, but merely as a heavily branded, singing commodity. The aftermath of this intervention solidified a rigid, unbreakable operational formula. When the studio caved to Parker's demands, forcing the inclusion of out-of-place songs, a clear precedent was set. Artistic merit would always be subordinate to merchandising. The realization was stark and structural. Regardless of his physical commitment on the harsh desert sets or his desire to study complex character motivations, his management viewed him strictly as a cross-promotional tool. Consequently, his approach to the craft shifted from dedicated preparation to mechanical compliance. The drive to perform grueling stunts or push for raw authenticity was replaced by a strict adherence to the daily call sheet. Contracts were subsequently drafted with ironclad clauses that guaranteed musical interludes, ensuring no future director could attempt a purely dramatic narrative. He had challenged the Hollywood machine's financial priorities, and the machine had effortlessly reasserted its dominance, legally ensuring that his primary function on any film set was to generate accompanying vinyl sales rather than deliver a cinematic performance. The devastating failure of his artistic rebellion did not occur in a vacuum. It was meticulously engineered by a man who fundamentally viewed the silver screen not as a canvas for human expression, but as an assembly line for mass-produced commodities. To truly comprehend the depths of this cinematic purgatory, one must examine the cold, calculating mindset of the architect who built the walls of this cowboy prison, Colonel Tom Parker. A number of historians point out that Parker, A man whose sensibilities were permanently tethered to the sawdust rings and illusionist tricks of the traveling carnivals of his youth, recognized an unprecedented financial alchemy in the B-tier Hollywood Western. The business model of these productions was staggering in its ruthless efficiency. They required virtually no substantial investment in elaborate sets. A barren stretch of the Mojave Desert, a rented herd of horses, and a few wooden facades were entirely sufficient to create the illusion of the untamed frontier. The shooting schedules were brutally compressed, often wrapping in a matter of weeks, yet the box office returns, driven exclusively by the blind loyalty of a massive fan base, yielded astronomical, almost incomprehensible profits. For a manager whose sole metric of success was the relentless accumulation of wealth, this formulaic approach was a flawless, inexhaustible gold mine. Parker realized that as long as his client was placed on a horse and handed a guitar, the quality of the script, the integrity of the director, and the psychological well-being of the actor were completely irrelevant details. Having identified this highly lucrative formula, Parker systematically constructed what many film scholars now view as a legally binding contract of artistic servitude. He established an ironclad monopoly over script approval, erecting an impenetrable barrier between the young actor and any visionary directors or writers who might have offered him a lifeline out of the desert. Parker absolutely forbade the acceptance of any roles that possessed psychological depth, moral ambiguity, or genuine dramatic weight, fearing that such complexities would alienate the reliable record-buying demographic. Instead, he forced his client to wade into a humiliating, seemingly endless swamp of cheap, derivative musical comedies that cynically masqueraded as westerns. Titles like Tickle Me and Stay Away, Joe became the agonizing daily reality of his professional existence. These were not films. They were thinly veiled feature-length advertisements designed to sell soundtrack albums. The scripts were painfully juvenile, demanding that the once rebellious icon engage in farcical slapstick fistfights, serenade livestock, and romance an endless parade of interchangeable leading ladies in situations that bordered on the absurd. For a man who had once spent hours obsessively studying the intense, brooding performances of the actor's studio, being handed these vapid, insulting pages every morning was a form of prolonged psychological torture. Each new contract signed by his management was another nail in the coffin of his cinematic legitimacy, trapping him in a saccharine, brightly colored nightmare from which he was legally forbidden to wake. The agony of this artistic confinement was deeply exacerbated by the seismic shifts occurring just outside the walls of his studio prison. The mid to late 1960s was a period of radical, thrilling reinvention within the Hollywood Western genre. While Elvis was being forced to perform sanitized musical numbers in pristine, glittering cowboy outfits, his peers were aggressively tearing down the traditional frontier myth. Audiences were being introduced to a new, breathtakingly cynical breed of gunslinger, most notably embodied by Clint Eastwood in the groundbreaking, gritty landscapes of the Dollars trilogy. Eastwood was redefining the very essence of American cinematic masculinity through a lens of sweat, silence, and profound moral ambiguity. He wore a filthy, sun-bleached poncho, chewed on a cheap cigar, and shot first, capturing a raw, dangerous authenticity that completely revolutionized the industry. The stark, humiliating juxtaposition between Eastwood's revolutionary, sun-baked realism, and Elvis's mandated sequin-studded charades was impossible to ignore. A number of sources indicate that Elvis was acutely, painfully aware of this massive cultural shift, watching his contemporaries evolve into respected iconoclastic artists while he was contractually regressed into a walking punchline, generated a profound, crippling sense of professional inadequacy. He was forced to watch from the sidelines of history, fully aware that he possessed the raw, smoldering charisma to rival any of the great anti-heroes of the era, yet he was chained down by a manager who refused to let him draw a real weapon. This inescapable contrast birthed a devastating psychological complex, the agonizing stigma of the fake cowboy. The crushing realization that he was perceived by the serious Hollywood establishment as a talentless, manufactured fraud became an all-consuming obsession. He harbored a deep, terrifying insecurity that the veteran stuntmen, the seasoned character actors, and the visionary directors secretly viewed him with thinly veiled contempt, seeing him not as a peer, but as a heavily funded studio gimmick. To conceal this immense, overwhelming shame, and to muster the sheer physical willpower required to walk onto a set and deliver lines, he found personally repulsive his reliance on a clandestine network of prescription medications escalated to unprecedented levels. The pills were no longer merely a mechanism to cope with the physical exhaustion of the Dust Bowl sets or the lingering grief of his early artistic failures. They became a desperate, heavy curtain drawn over a reality he could no longer stand to look at. The daily consumption of powerful uppers and downers surged wildly, acting as a chemical anesthetic against the daily burning humiliation of his profession. He required stimulants just to force his lips into the boyish, carefree smile the directors demanded, and he required massive doses of tranquilizers to quiet the screaming, agonizing voice of his own wasted potential when the cameras finally stopped rolling. The architect of his career had successfully built an empire of staggering wealth, but in doing so, he had trapped a desperately hurting human being in a fake celluloid frontier, forcing him to consume lethal amounts of medication merely to survive the unbearable shame of his own reflection. By the twilight of the 1960s, the cultural landscape of America had violently shifted, leaving the sanitized, studio-manufactured cowboy myth choking in the dust of a new, cynical era. The world was burning with social revolution. The anti-war movement was tearing through the zeitgeist, and cinematic audiences were demanding a raw, unvarnished reflection of their own disillusionment. Yet trapped within his lucrative, inescapable contract, Elvis Presley remained a glittering anachronism, a tragic ghost condemned to endlessly repeat the same humiliating, squeaky-clean cinematic charades. It was within this suffocating atmosphere of intense cultural irrelevance and profound personal shame that he decided to mount one final, desperate, and ultimately devastating stand. In 1969, he signed on to star in a stark, unforgiving Western titled Charo, a project that he fiercely believed would be his ultimate artistic redemption. This was to be his cinematic crucifixion and resurrection. He approached the role with a visceral, almost terrifying intensity, determined to violently execute the fake cowboy persona that had tormented him for over a decade. He underwent a stark, bitter, physical metamorphosis. For the first time in his Hollywood career, he grew a thick, scruffy beard bearing his world-famous boyish features, beneath a layer of harsh, undeniable masculinity. He draped himself in filthy, unwashed, dust-caked garments, insisting on looking like a man who had truly slept in the unforgiving dirt of the frontier. Most crucially, he issued a rigid, non-negotiable ultimatum. He would not sing a single note on camera. There would be no guitar, no smiling serenades to leading ladies, and no soundtrack album to soften the blow. He was stripping himself bare, offering his raw, traumatized soul to the camera in a desperate plea to finally be recognized as a legitimate, dramatic actor capable of carrying the heavy, bleeding weight of a true Western narrative. However, the Hollywood machine, a vast, unfeeling apparatus built entirely on predictable profit margins, possessed a long, unforgiving memory and zero tolerance for artistic insubordination. When the studio executives and his management realized that Elvis was genuinely attempting to shatter the highly lucrative mold they had spent years meticulously crafting, they did not support his evolution. They actively, coldly orchestrated its destruction. Many film historians and industry insiders argue that the production of Charo was not merely mismanaged, it was subjected to a calculated, punitive sabotage. The studio brutally slashed the film's budget to a pathetic fraction of what a leading star of his caliber commanded, effectively starving the picture of the resources necessary to create a convincing, immersive frontier world. They assigned the project to a profoundly weak, uninspired directorial team and forced the cast to work with a disjointed, heavily compromised script that had been haphazardly stitched together. The sets felt cheap, the supporting cast was underdeveloped, and the entire production was cloaked in an atmosphere of cynical indifference. It was a clear, undeniable punishment from the architects of his career, a brutal message from the Hollywood establishment that they would not tolerate his deviation from the singing cowboy formula. They were deliberately setting him up to fail, ensuring that his foray into serious, dramatic acting would be an embarrassing catastrophe, thereby forcing him back into the sequin, profitable cage they controlled. When Charo was finally released into theaters, the result was a catastrophic, soul-crushing failure that reverberated through the deepest chambers of his psyche. The film was met with widespread critical apathy and dismal box office returns, entirely failing to resonate with an audience that either wanted the old, singing Elvis or had already moved on to the gritty realism of the new Hollywood movement. For the man who had staked his last remaining shred of artistic dignity on this singular performance, the public rejection was a lethal blow. He had worn the dirt, he had grown the beard, he had suffered the indignity of a starved production, and he had poured his profound, aching desperation into the camera, only to be met with a collective shrug from the world. The psychological devastation was absolute and irreversible. He realized, with a horrifying, paralyzing clarity, that the metamorphosis he so desperately craved was a biological and contractual impossibility. The studio system had successfully permanently calcified his image. He was trapped in amber, forever doomed to be the hollow myth they had marketed to the masses. The failure of Charo was not just the end of a movie, it was the violent, unequivocal death of his artistic soul. It extinguished the very last ember of hope that he could ever escape the cinematic prison built by Colonel Tom Parker and the studio executives. As his artistic rebellions were systematically crushed, his drug consumption surged far beyond simple pain management. becoming a mandated tool for survival. His private medical team, most notably Dr. George Nicopolis, constructed a ruthless pharmacological loop, prescribing over 10,000 doses of narcotics, amphetamines, and sedatives in 1977 alone. This network actively prioritized the maintenance of a highly lucrative asset over the basic survival of a human being, artificially inflating his failing cardiovascular system with stimulants just to get him on camera, then crashing it with hypnotics at night. Ultimately, there was no cinematic fade to black. The man who embodied the ultimate American myth passed away alone in a Memphis bathroom, his heart failing under the crushing weight of a legally prescribed chemical regimen. Today, millions of fans still stream his remastered classics, marveling at the invincible icon frozen on screen. But this enduring illusion serves as a stark, tragic warning. To build an eternal monument in American pop culture, a profoundly gifted man was systematically consumed by the very machinery he helped enrich.